Welcome to AI Australia, brought to you by Eliza. On this show, your hosts James Wilson and Nigel Dalton have in-depth conversations with technology leaders, academics, and AI professionals about all things artificial intelligence. We'll explore a broad range of topics, including AI strategy, technology, and ethics, providing valuable insights for Australian businesses at all stages of AI adoption. And now, your hosts, James and Nigel.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Australian AI podcast. I'm James Wilson and I'm here with Nigel Dalton. Nigel, how are you going today?
Very well, thank you, James. It's a thrill to be getting a podcast going on this topic. It is the topic, I think, for Australian business for the next 5 to 10 years. What better to do than talk to people about it and find some Australian experts? Yeah,
and we've spoken a lot about digging out and getting to some of the amazing talent in Australia that's doing great things around AI, both from practical implementation and from some of the broader kind of ethics conversations.
Who have we got on the show today?
Well, today, Nigel, we're speaking with Ellen Broad, and Ellen's an expert in data sharing, open data, and AI ethics. And Nigel, it was actually you that got me onto Ellen in the first place, I think, after seeing her speak at Agile Australia earlier this year. And off the back of that, you said, I've got to read this book, which she'd recently published, which is called Made by Humans, The AI Condition. And it's fair to say that I've loved it, and I've been sharing it with pretty much everyone I've come across over the last few months.
Yeah, my strongest advice to anyone attending one of these conferences as a speaker is do not speak after Ellen Broad. The audience will be lost already.
I think that's pretty good advice.
I think, Nigel, you did speak after me, didn't you?
I did, yes.
All right. Well, on that, why don't we get into it and bring Ellen into the conversation?
Absolutely. Welcome to the show, Ellen.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Ellen, you're a globally renowned expert in the field of data ethics and AI. You've worked around the world. You've advised governments, organizations, universities, corporates. You've spoken at some of the biggest conferences in the world, and you've recently published your first book. It's an incredible career journey that you've had. And can you share with our audience just how this kind of career journey of yours has unfolded and the path that's kind of taken you to where you are today?
Yeah, sure. And it's an interesting question to answer, and it's how I start the book, actually, because I can't really articulate a clear career path or a set of circumstances that explain how I've ended up working on data ethics and artificial intelligence and just in technology altogether, because I really do not have a stellar background in science or maths or computer programming. I wasn't even a particularly outstanding student, full stop, when I was at university. So I studied law and arts, majoring in English literature while I was at university, but I was essentially your quintessential late teens, early 20s university student in that I had no idea what I wanted to do. I was more interested in being off campus. I moved to Paris and lived there for a year on very little money and worked in a jazz cafe. I really spent most of my time at university in a state of existential angst about exactly what I was going to do when I finished. And then lo and behold, when I finished, I encountered the problem that I think a lot of university students face. And in fact, more and more, which is you finish and you don't really have a clear career to go into. Graduate positions are getting smaller and smaller, and you essentially end up looking around for whatever job will take you. And in my case, I applied for lots of different positions and ended up running a very small non-profit called the Australian Digital Alliance, which did technology policy and just became progressively more interested in technology issues and the engineering side of things from there. And when I think back, it's funny hearing you describe my career journey so far in terms of working in different countries and speaking at big conferences, because at the time you don't think about it that way. I've definitely never set out to work in several countries, and I mean, I would never have thought of myself as speaking, at conferences like South by Southwest, for example. But I guess it's just a combination of saying yes to things when opportunities presented themselves. I've always tried really hard to just say yes to things, particularly when I'm terrified that I probably can't do them, and just being really keenly aware of topics that I find interesting. So even ethics is something that I had nothing to do with when I started this career, and it's just over the last few years it's become a more and more central part of what I do.
I'm very excited that you've blown the stereotype that the only job for someone with an arts degree is working at McDonald's. As someone with a social science degree who couldn't even aspire to that level of career advancement, it's fabulous. That putting the A into the STEAM agenda, I think is super important. Hey, look, I'm fascinated with the same. You've had such a varied background. Arts degree, English literature. Is there anything from the world of literature that you think really does a good job of examining ethics? I mean, Shakespeare had a crack at that question. Science fiction looks at it all the time. Any memorable books?
So books that had a really profound influence on me, I'm rereading at the moment Isaac Asimov's I, Robot, which is a series of short stories about different contexts within which robots applying the 3 laws of robotics are interrelating with humans. I read it years ago, and I think all we actually think about in relation to that book are the 3 laws. We don't kind of think about the complexities of those in real world context, which is exactly what the book is about. And so things like, particularly right now in our conversations around artificial intelligence and when a robot will have achieved consciousness and how we build ethical machines, that book really explodes the notion that it's as simple as programming rules into a robot that they will follow. One of the short stories that's really sticking with me at the moment is, and people have probably forgotten about the short stories in detail, but there's one about a robot called Herbie, who can read minds, which at first is seen as very exciting. And the scientists go to Herbie to tell them how the other scientists are feeling and thinking, without realizing that because the first law of robotics is robots cannot cause harm to humans or indirectly cause harm to occur to humans, that the robot is lying to each of them because it knows that the truth would cause them harm. And it becomes this really fascinating short story about how non-truths are harmful as well as truths, and just how complex trying to apply very simple statements like do not cause harm to humans are in these nuanced contexts. So that book at the moment is front of mind. And then, of course, there are others like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that I studied at university that was really interesting and important to me as well.
Yeah, well, I'm with you on this one. Poor old James, he's got a degree in all matters of technology and science, and 2 social scientists hogging the mics. But I've just finished a great book called The Punch Escrow, Tal Klein's science fiction novel set in 2160 or thereabouts. And what the world's done is it's managed to perfect teleportation. Mm-hmm. So this is fantastic. And effectively little booths have popped up all over the world. And this company called IT, International Teleportation or something like that, Transit or something, you can pop into the booth, pay a few coins and be transported anywhere in the world. I mean, who needs public transport in Melbourne? That would be pretty damn useful for getting to work sometimes. The moral dilemma that emerges is a character through a technological era discovers that they're not actually teleporting the atoms and quarks that make up a human being. They're printing another one and deleting the original. And so you can guess the moral dilemma. Is this murder?
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
And the escrow is the fact that they store them on the cloud in between time in case there's a printing error.
Honestly, we should just have a podcast about science fiction, because now I'm already thinking about more titles to recommend. But anyway, I'll stop.
I think it's a really important thing. The last 100 years of science fiction has probably presented more forward thinking about the state we find ourselves in 2018. My boss, Tracy Fellows, was sort of explaining to me yesterday, her concern is that we've reached peak technology disruption, peak ability to get data, and the nadir of trust, all at the same time.
Just if I could recommend one more, and I know we have to move on to the topic, but you just made me think of an Australian novel. Another science fiction novel. I don't know if you've read Jennifer Government by Max Barry. It's like a pulpy science fiction in that it's very fast paced and it's just really enjoyable, but it's about this near future in which technology corporations and other for-profit entities become essentially the driving forces in society, and government's political power is really limited. And it's, again, I think very much in the vein of what's happening now, that, you know, political institutions are being weakened while we have these massive kind of power structures in our private sector. So just one more recommendation by an Australian novelist that I would support.
So you obviously love books. Tell us a little bit more about your book.
So Made by Humans, the AI Condition, came out of perhaps a frustration with the way that we started talking about artificial intelligence a few years ago now, which is we always, in the popular kind of discourse in media articles, would talk about algorithms making decisions, AI making predictions, as though they were divorced from humans, and kind of rendering ourselves helpless in the process. And this came through in lots of contexts. When we would talk about a number of jobs to be replaced by automated services, the point in the future at which robots would be smarter than human, I felt that we were failing to understand that these services are built by humans and may not be perfect, that there are many complexities and challenges that all designers face when trying to build an automated system, no matter how simple or complex, but also that we were selling ourselves short in terms of just how complex humans are as those people, those beings that machines have to interact with. So, you know, having a discussion like 70% of jobs will be replaced by robots, or in this year the robot will become smarter than a human, only really is an easy argument to have if you take a very homogeneous, flat view of what the scale or the sum of human achievement is and the kind of type of human intelligence. So the book, I guess, came out of that frustration. And I wanted to place the focus back on humans as the lifeblood, if you like, of artificial intelligence.
Love it. And I think there was a quote early on that really has kind of stuck with me from reading the book, and you describe it, and you said that, you know, the pristine sheen of AI can mask the human fingerprints underneath. And I think that's kind of what you were just touching on there, with, you know, recognizing the fact that, you know, these machines and systems are built by humans. But can you just talk a little bit about that particular quote? Because I think that really, you know, sums up a lot of the great content in the book.
So I definitely was thinking about myself and what it was like being outside the industry and then being inside it, where even now, it's kind of hard to remember just how much the workings of the web, the workings of the software on our machines is hidden to the people who use them every day. Because if you're someone who just turns on your computer and uses Microsoft Word or loads up Google and enters in your search terms, it's instantaneous, it's effortless, it seems completely accessible and transparent. And what happens behind that is gobbledygook. It's mystery. And you have this sense, it's like it's an obliviousness to it. I remember working in a department a few years after having worked much more on the technical side of things, and realizing that when people load up a web page and they get the kind of broken image icon, they will assume that it's the website's fault and not their browser being out of date. Like the kind of sense of how your machine works is really not something that we teach people or even kind of expect or give them hints essentially about that there are kind of lots of different parts within a system, that there are lots of different components going into it, built by different people and organizations that all have to fit together. We just have created these perfect, simple interfaces. Well, now that I work with them, I'm like, they're rarely ever simple, but that's how they appear to the general public. And I think that makes it very hard for people to grasp that it's slightly more complex than it appears on the surface. And the classic example is, I still remember when I first started working quite closely with engineers in the UK was probably when I first started working on a daily basis with engineers, getting them to help me with tasks, watching how they worked, and realizing that I don't know is such a common and normal part of your kind of daily life as an engineer. I think for me that was such a moment of realizing actually this is complicated, because I don't think you never see the humans behind it, and to realize how much of their life is spent trying to figure out where a particular bug is, Googling the solutions to problems, copying from other existing libraries. Like, this is just really hard, and a lot of the time you don't quite know what the answer is. We don't talk about that essentially in the popular discourse. It's just shiny and it just works.
And you talk a bit as well about this, this concept of bias, and that people naturally trust or take for granted the output of a machine. When a machine tells them something or a system tells them something, that it's almost kind of wired to believe it. And as we as we progress some of the use cases for machine learning and AI technologies become a little bit more high impact to people, that introduces a whole raft of concerns.
And I don't know really that we have biases as humans in how we interact with machines has been well researched, even before getting into artificial intelligence, that we suffer from automation bias, that we rely on things to just work, and that we assume that the outputs that we're given in lots of circumstances are accurate. There's been lots of really interesting research in aviation and military contexts, looking at how people make decisions when it's in relationships with machines. Like, this is a human flaw that we have. And so I think our responsibility as designers becomes, how do we give people the red flags to understand what flaws might exist? And an analogy that I use, because when we talk about bias, for example, in systems and bias in decision-making algorithms, one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is that the word bias as a word makes the designers of systems defensive, because it kind of implies a knowledge of what you're doing, or an intent, a maliciousness, when actually it's these more subtle, ingrained, subconscious, unintentionally reflecting a particular worldview type decisions that we make that are not deliberately designed to be malevolent, but just are the natural result of the fact that we are human and we design in accordance with the experiences that we have. Right now, I have a bug to pick with Apple's manufacturers of the iPhone, because they assume everyone has gigantic hands. We all have little biases that shape the way that we design. And the analogy that I think about with, coupled with, we know that we have these worldviews, we know that we're human as designers, that we will make certain decisions that might inadvertently shape people, coupled with the fact that we know that humans interacting with our machines are just going to trust them, that we have this other on the flip side of our design are these humans that are vulnerable to believing what it is that they're presented with. Then it becomes, how do we give them those red flags? And the analogy that I like to use is, when you hop in your car, you have a bunch of warning lights that may or may not illuminate on your dashboard. and you have smells and sounds that trigger warnings for you. You know, the car smells funny, or it's leaving an oil stain, or it's making a particular noise. And so we've developed not only these kind of common sense triggers of something might not be quite right, but also given cars certain indicators and warning lights to help alert people that something might not be working. And so my kind of thinking is, how do we help expose that in machines? And the way that we currently do it, I don't think is the right way, where you just constantly give people, you have a software update your software. When I watch my mother on the computer, there's invariably 30 to 40 software updates. She's 4 versions of iOS behind because she just ignores them. They're not presented to her in a way that appears like a warning sign. Something may not be quite right. It's just a very bland software update. I assume you know what that means. So I think we have a lot of work to do in helping people understand how machines work and give them the triggers to understand what the points of failure might be.
And what is it why is this so important, do you think, kind of right now? And obviously, you know, you've had a sense of kind of urgency and purpose to write the book. And why do we need to be so wary of this now?
Because we're in the middle of a boom. We are, at the moment, selling solutions in a range of contexts for everything from defense purposes through to government delivery of services through to commercial contexts, selling products as AI, as accurate, as highly reliable, without any real quality assurance mechanisms to assure ourselves that that's how they work. So it seems to me that at the moment we're at a point of particular vulnerability because there's so much money that can be spent on AI. I spend a lot of time with organizations talking to me about the endless round of consultancies they have selling them AI products and how hard it is to distinguish one from the other and understand what good looks like. So we need to be having conversations about what quality assurance mechanisms we need, what our responsibilities are as designers, because we're vulnerable at the moment. We're both innately more likely to believe the systems, and our systems may actually be more likely not to be very good at this particular time.
Yeah, and I suppose when you're shifting from, if you're selecting a movie on Netflix and you're giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down, that's probably sufficient QA for a pretty benign experience like watching a film. But when we're talking about defence and lives at stake, we need something more.
Yeah, I think the hospital examples are some of the most fascinating because of the, you know, apparently scientific 1-0, this person's got asthma, this person doesn't have asthma, this person has identifiable breast cancer, this person doesn't. Very, very tempting for us to automate and increase our scale of care in a hospital situation and hand that over to an algorithm while the humans do the more complex diagnostic stuff.
There's a really lovely long-form piece by Siddhartha Mukherjee, who you might have read. He wrote The Emperor of Maladies, and he's also just recently written a book about the history of the genome. But he wrote a piece about thinking of the occurrence of cancer in terms of systems and ecologies rather than is it present or is it not present? Because one of the really interesting discussions going on in healthcare at the moment is that while we're becoming better at detecting breast cancer, for example, and prostate cancer, we're getting really, really good at detection. Actually, what we're discovering is some forms of cancer being detected are not what kills people. That some forms of cancer cells can live in the body without actually having any external symptoms and may never actually be the cause of death. And so it's exposed this really interesting problem in healthcare, which is the existence of something does not necessarily imply causation. So then when when you are approaching automation, you are essentially relying on causation holding. You are relying on being able to say, okay, well, I have detected this anomaly. It will have these consequences. And my approach to that is to initiate these treatments. And so research and reflections like his, I find they're really interesting in exposing just how nuanced and complicated healthcare is as something to be automated.
Although the automation isn't new, is it? I worked in financial services in the 1990s with armies of actuaries. I mean, the job of actuary was invented 100 years before. And I remember the most sort of shocking moment was when one of them says, well, we'll just pop you in the spreadsheet and I'll tell you the day you're going to die. Fundamentally, that is the bet they were taking on me with my life insurance. And God, goodness, that was the stock in trade of an actuary. It was like the 30th of May 2040. And it's like, that's so precise. And now I fear that date. Mm-hmm. So that automation of decisioning has been around for a lot longer than our kind of generation of concerned liberal thinkers.
Oh, I completely agree. And there are many areas in which we automate sensibly and practically. You can look at the delivery of online services in general terms. There's a whole raft of kind of automation of tasks that used to be done by a human, moving from punch card setups in banks to databases that just had simple functionality like being able to sort your data set of customers into an order that meant that you could more easily retrieve information. That's all tasks that used to be done by humans that can be taken over by machines, and automating in areas where, for better or worse, you don't need a human to do that. I think of like cashless checkouts the same way. We have technology now that for some people, they don't need to interact with a checkout assistant. They can just swipe through and go about their day. They can order food to their homes. There's lots of kind of labor-related issues and discussions, of course, still about the assumptions that shape where we automate. Automation, it's not everyone can use an automated checkout. Not everyone can access, for example, like online services. But there's lots of repeatable, repetitive human tasks that we have automated throughout history with every new breakthrough in technology that I think are part of kind of technology's advancement. What I think is changing now is that we are taking what we think of as repeatable processes that actually have a lot of nuance behind them. So, the act of sorting through CVs for a job application, it on the surface is another repeatable, processable task that a computer can do as easily as a human. But actually, there is a difference between a piece of software that sorts the CVs that you have according to certain objective criteria, like puts them in alphabetical order for you, weeds out any that fail to reference selection criteria that were in your job advertisement, that turns them into a format that you can easily read. These are all kind of simple automatable tasks. And a piece of software that will read them for you and tell you who the best candidate is. And that's where I think we're starting to get into new territory, is we're starting to think of what have been more complex human tasks as being as automatable as the sorting tasks, the ordering tasks, the processing tasks that have been part of automation in the past.
And do you think some of this then comes down to almost a lack of empathy for the people doing the work, or a lack of understanding of the work? Is that part of the challenge here? Is how do we ensure that people building these systems have real empathy for the person doing the work today? I've
been thinking about this a lot lately because I've been getting a little bit frustrated with some of the discussions that assume that all of these issues are new in technology and that the industry has never had to think about human-computer interaction before, when we've had professions that have emerged over the last 15 to 20 years precisely to help manage this interface. Your user experience designers, your ethnographers, your sociologists, your front-end developers. But it's made me wonder if... So I remember the popular descriptions of computer science and computer programming when I was a kid, and in movies like Revenge of the Nerds, Back to the Future, where what made you want to be a computer programmer was not having to interact with humans. You know, it was, you don't have to interact with these dumb humans who don't understand how your technology works, and you don't have to deal with the messiness of human interactions, and that this is an escape from the messiness of the kind of human to human world. And we see that carried through in sitcoms today, like The Big Bang Theory. Even in Silicon Valley, there's still this very persuasive characterization of computer science as a profession within which you can retreat from the world and focus on machines. And I think that has caused damage for us in trying to build empathy, because it has not been seen as part of the necessary or desirable skill set in a developer. And even when you look at the professions that have emerged, the professions that I just mentioned, your user experience designers, your front-end developers, they have all been new roles inserted between those engineering and development roles and the humans at the other end. So the essential role of the engineer has never really changed. They're still like, I will stay in my room, or like, I will focus on my computer and you will tell me what the humans over there want. And I think positively, I think there's a lot of organizations that are thinking about that. And I also know lots of very social, high EQ, thoughtful engineers and developers who that is not their kind of approach to technology. But I think it's given us almost a free pass on having to think about humans, because all of these stereotypes have kind of helped present an idea that it's okay to think, or actually it's okay to avoid thinking about the complexity in that way of like people that may not agree with you, that may have a completely different worldview of you. You never have to interact with that. You never have to explain what it is that you're doing, because we'll bring in people to do that for you. And I think that has been a challenge for us now. I think there's a lot that is going on to try and reintroduce empathy and introduce friction, basically, create a little discomfort for our engineers and developers designing systems who have previously not really had to think about that side of things.
So lawyers and doctors are going to be immediately familiar with what ethics are. Doctors signing Hippocratic oaths, lawyers studying ethics. Do you have a snappy description for the field of ethics that you would use to explain to a board of directors who are probably older, business successful, don't consider themselves to be tech people type of human beings, or executives? What's your snappy definition of ethics?
So, this is a good question, because actually in the course of writing the book, I ended up saying talking about ethics is complicated. What we're actually talking about is accountability. Like when you think about the medical profession studying ethics and lawyers studying ethics, actually what they are trained and taught is how to articulate their decisions, and in what kinds of contexts being able to explain the ethical parameters or the framework that you use to make your decision is important, and how you'll be held accountable for that. So I guess my snappy for like a business, and particularly for businesses, what they care about is not really like, well, some do care about ethics, but you're more thinking about what are you responsible for? What is your accountability? It is very hard. In the book, for example, I talk about the focus on ethics alone, perhaps making it harder for us to have discussions around artificial intelligence. Because if you look at, for example, the study of ethics in the medical profession and the legal profession, both of those are professions that we would not say are just now inherently ethical and absent of scandal or dubious conduct. Ethics helps us consider the consequences of our decisions, who they might affect. But I increasingly, and I wonder if this is because at one point I did do a law degree that I thought I'd forgotten all about, but is coming back to me, is I increasingly think about these things in terms of like fiduciary responsibilities. When you have more knowledge than anyone else in the room, what are your responsibilities as the person with that knowledge to help other people understand the consequences? And so doctors and lawyers, for example, yes, they have ethics training, still doesn't mean they'll necessarily make ethical decisions, but they also have responsibilities because they hold information that others won't. Doctors have a medical degree. They therefore have certain obligations to be transparent with patients about how they came to a diagnosis, to explain courses of treatment, to help patients understand the different kinds of treatment they might receive. Lawyers, one of the worst units that I remember doing, and it's the last one you do at university precisely because it is so boring, is procedure and legal drafting, which is essentially a whole semester spent writing out complex legal precedents in the most straightforward, basic way so that they can be communicated to a kind of a client, a person that you're trying to articulate options to. And that's basically, I know that's like not a snappy ethics comment, but I guess my response to kind of how would you communicate ethics to business people is you're just trying to articulate what your responsibilities are, what you're going to be held accountable for, and then kind of ethical frameworks flow from that.
I think we've through the last kind of decade of being around kind of digital, you see these roles, as you pointed out before, emerge. These new roles emerge that are almost in response to failure. They're kind of failure demand roles that are there to kind of deal with an underlying issue rather than solving the underlying issue. We'll put a role in there to kind of mask it. Do you think there's do you have a concern then? Do you see organisations following history there and kind of putting some kind of ethics role, a figurehead ethics role on a project, on an AI project to try and mask this? Do you think that's a risk that you're seeing? I
do see that as a risk, and I also see one of the reasons I've become really uneasy about ethics is because ethics is inherently complex and context specific. And my approach to ethics, what I believe are ethical principles and like my set of morals, may be different from yours. It might be different from another part of my organization, but both will be wholly valid. So a lovely classic example that an emergency doctor gave me was, you might be a patient with a chronic illness who presents in emergency, and you have like serious end of life issues. You are not going to recover from your chronic illness. And you have two doctors, one of whom believes that their role is to prolong life no matter what, and one whose ethical framework is driven by the sense that you need to alleviate suffering as your first priority. And depending on which medical professional you get, you may have a wholly different outcome in that emergency situation. But both of those are like valid, they are reasonable responses to those situations. And so what I see like with ethics roles is not only that this risk that will mask it, that it'll just become, we'll generate an ethics guide and we'll just nudge decisions up to the ethics officer. They'll tell us what they think and then we'll ignore it. But actually, that one approach to ethics will come to dominate discussions around consequences. So instead of getting that robust debate within an organization where everyone feels as though they should be thinking about the consequences of a system and coming at that from different angles, it'll become like no, just the data scientists feeling like they can interpret ethics, or just the ethics officer feeling like it's their responsibility. And that concerns me because it's inherently complex, and what you want is the friction. You want the debate.
I thought in your book you made a very good point around how when it's bad, it's really obvious to us. And particularly, I thought you really actually crisply defined it in a paragraph. Centrelink's automated debt recovery program fails to meet the standards of ethical AI. Transparency of methodology, data and assumptions, diligence and care resolving issues and errors before deployment, and meaningful ways for people to engage and challenge automated decisions. So just Robodebt failed every single one of those possible hurdles. Are there any examples you carry of people doing this well in Australia today?
It's hard because we don't, particularly in government contexts, talk about successes. So it's hard to think of a tangible example right now in Australia, not because I don't think they don't exist, but because we don't talk about successes in the same way that we're extremely eager and quick to talk about failures. I can give an example, and it's an example I use in the book, of a very similar system that was employed in a county in the United States. And what I think is interesting about it is, so it was I want to say it was the Allegheny County screening tool. And in a sense, it's like the inverse of Centrelink's automated debt recovery. They held town halls with the people who would be affected by the automation of, it was call centres about potential at-risk children in families. So it was helping those first responders to calls try to assess whether they were dealing with a high-risk situation or a low-risk situation. And in lots of process-driven ways, all of that list that you just cited about Centrelink, they adhered to. The methodology was transparent. They were transparent about the level of accuracy that risk-based model had. They put in place processes to ensure that it was never the system making a decision, that it was the human making the decision. They trained the humans to not automatically believe whatever the system was telling them, but to also apply their own knowledge and expertise and gut reactions. They brought the community along with them. They tried to design in a transparent, ethical, engaged way, giving people the opportunity to challenge the results of that system as well. And so by my definition, that is therefore an ethical system. But that doesn't mean that everyone thinks it is. So Virginia Eubanks, for example, who talks about the same system in her book, Automating Inequality, comes down on the opposite conclusion that that my definition would help you come to, because as she also rightly points out, it doesn't change the underlying problems with how we scrutinize and report at-risk behaviours. That if you are poor, you are more likely to be caught up in a system like that. That if you are black, you are more likely to be caught up in a system like that. And her ultimate opinion is we shouldn't be automating services like that. Actually, we should be reinvesting in the human side interactions and reducing the level of bureaucracy and automation and you're a number in a phone queue type approach that we've come to bring to welfare contexts. So I guess that, again, is just a really nice articulation of how complex this is, because by my definition, they've done as much as they can to try and make sure that the system is as good as it can be. But they don't really touch on the kind of fundamental question of whether you should be automating in that context at all. So I think, again, that's the argument in the Centrelink context is they could have designed a automated debt recovery system that was well designed, had various rigorous quality assurance mechanisms in place to ensure that the debts that they were drawing up were accurate. That might not do anything about perhaps the realities, and I don't say this with knowledge, but I'm thinking about what your assumptions might be is building the perfect system for recovering debts still implies that your process for allocating payments is perfect, that that it is not confusing for individuals claiming welfare, that they are not misled, that there are not circumstances that expose them to the likelihood of debt. So basically, #it's complicated. And I think we have some really difficult discussions ahead around, well, where should we automate in the first place?
And looking around the world over the last kind of probably even 6 months, lots of governments, France, the UK, have all kind of announced large investments in research around ethics and automation. And I think earlier this year, Dr. Alan Finkel, Australia's chief scientist, put forward this idea of what he called the Turing certificate, which was, I guess, kind of codifying a lot of these standards and creating a standard or quality mark for these kind of systems. And, there's been obviously quite vocal response to that on both sides of the argument. What's your perspective on this? Do you think this is a direction that we should be pushing towards?
I do think pushing towards kind of external mechanisms of validation of a system are always useful. We use them in lots of other contexts as well to kind of signify quality. We have building codes, we have star ratings for appliances, we have energy efficiency ratings. They're never wholly perfect, but they attempt to bring some baseline expectations to the way that we design products and services that humans are going to rely on. So I think it's definitely the right direction to be going in. What I remember having a conversation with Dr. Finkel about is one of the problems that we have with AI is, unlike all of the examples that I just mentioned, in how we design buildings, how we manufacture food, how we manufacture appliances, unlike all of those sector-specific contexts, the tools and technologies that we're talking about are general purpose. And really what I think we'll end up getting into is, for specific sectors, specific markers of quality for automated systems might be used, and they might look different in different contexts. Because if you try and bring together in your head all of these different applications of even, the set of models and processes that are within just the umbrella of machine learning, which is itself not just a homogeneous, it always looks like this, we're always using these algorithms, but even just in that one, if you are using machine learning, you should do X, Y, Z, it very quickly breaks down. I think instead what we'll end up doing is, like, if you are using or relying on these technologies and tools in the diagnostic context in healthcare, these are the markers of quality that we would expect to see. And one of the things that I think we're not talking enough about is that in order to have those markers of quality, or to have those quality assurance markers, we have to change the way that we design and the standards that we design to and the processes that we follow. So standards become really important. So I do a lot of work at the moment in data standards. So what are the frameworks and rules that organizations should have to follow if they're going to be building APIs to share energy data, for example? It is extremely hard across lots of industries right now in data contexts to compare systems because they're all bespoke. You don't have an apples to apples comparison to make in order to provide certification. So that is something that I think we haven't talked about enough, which is, okay, if you're going to certify, you need apples to apples, you need like with like systems that you can actually compare. And at the moment, we use an enormous variety of languages, frameworks, libraries, tools to design, and there's no real standardized expectations around that.
And if you're a business leader and you have someone in your company come to you and say, I've got this great idea for how we can use AI to solve this problem, You don't know much about this field. What would be the kind of 2 or 3 guiding principles you think that a business leader should have front of mind when they're evaluating the first AI project that comes across their desk?
Okay, so if I had someone inside my organization come to me and say, I'd like to use AI to solve this problem, I would ask them to first define what is the problem, to help them articulate what it is that they are trying to solve. Quite often, particularly at the moment, because we're in a hype cycle, it's actually the other way around. People say, we want to use AI in our business. Let's look around and find a problem that we can solve. So starting with, okay, well, what is it that you think the problem is? Now, what is it that you think that usually when they're talking about AI, they're talking about probabilistic systems, automating something, using data analytics. So what is it that you think we can improve about that problem using technology or using this? And what would our risks be? I really deliberately avoided asking a question like, what do you mean when you say AI then, as one of my 3 questions, because I think as a business leader, as a decision maker, you want to avoid the technical detail. You want to avoid a conversation about, well, we're going to use TensorFlow to do X, Y, Z, and then I'm going to, use graph analytics to do X, Y, Z over here. You cannot engage at that level. You want to provoke an articulation of the problem and why this is the appropriate solution, and ask, why might it not be the appropriate solution? What are the risks to this approach? And if they can't respond satisfactorily to those questions, which are about your critical reflection, they're not about the technology, they're about connecting the technology to a problem and thinking about its consequences, I think that is a helpful framing for leaders and decision makers, because that's what you need to know. You just need to know, will this actually do what they're telling me it will do? What are the problems or risks that this might create? And will we actually get something out of it?
I think it's definitely made worse by this convoluted, bureaucratic decision-making systems we've built in Australian companies today. Where there's so many steering committees, governance groups, documents. The actual fundamental question of, is this the right thing to do? We can do it, but is it the right thing to do? Is slide 720 in a gigantic PowerPoint pack buried by how much money can we make? Is this feasible? How do we reduce the risk? Where's the Gantt chart? We sort of need the Gantt chart of ethics, which a generation of executives and directors start to grasp. My advice, James, would be quite simple. Every single one of them should be issued Ellen's book and forced to read.
I just think one of the mindsets that we've gotten into, and I don't know if it's generational, but I wonder if it's something that we're going to be able to break, is only thinking about certain parameters in how we make decisions. Like, how much will this cost us? And what will the margin be? What revenue will be generated from it? And only kind of framing the choices we have in response in terms of cost, efficiency, economic benefit. And that is, for most organizations, the way that they make decisions, but it does make it very hard to have that conversation about what is right, like what is safe in this context. And I even see that filtering into ethics. I think that focus solely on economic impact, cost, benefit has kind of affected some of the growing concerns people have, in those trends that I think, Nigel, you summarized at the beginning of the call at the beginning of the podcast, the kind of combination of what were the 3 things that your boss was describing?
Yeah, the 3 things: the growth of a digital business, the increased collection of data, and the nadir of our trust in the institutions who have access, and we get all of our data too. Yeah,
we kind of are really driven in terms of efficiencies, maximum revenue generation, and the trust is a natural kind of consequence of that, the dissolution of trust. And you can see this playing out in lots of contexts. And I even see this bleeding into the way we're starting to commercialize ethics in AI. Some organizations are naturally making their parameters around ethical decision making, like their XY axis of, like, here are your parameters for assessing risk and ethical concern. And one of those is impact on profit margin. And you're trying to find the sweet spot that has lowest impact on your profit margin and also reduces your kind of ethical risk. But sometimes it's just really hard to calculate consequence just within those parameters. And I keep coming back to in the book that actually a lot of the circumstances in which we have these really profound ethical scandals are where we do interpret the decisions we're making as being the greatest good for the least harm, greatest benefit for least cost, and failing to think about the real impact of our decision on a very specific group of people that it will affect. And I think that is a danger we're getting into even in the way we're framing ethics in organisations now.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ellen. And can you just tell our audience if they're interested in picking up a copy of your book or would love to come and engage with you, see you speak, where can they get a copy of your book and where can they see you over the coming months?
So hopefully you should be able to find a copy of the book at most bookstores in your city. It's also on Amazon and Booko and all of the major online platforms. There's a range of opportunities to hear me speak. I'm speaking at the Google Dev Fest in Melbourne on the 27th of October. That's coming up and I'm really excited about it. I'm doing a roundtable discussion with Dr. Alan Finkel and Alan Duffy and some other really interesting speakers in Adelaide next Friday that I know the Australian Science Channel has been involved in. There's Writers' Festival possibilities as well on the horizon, Geelong Nonfiction Writers' Festival. But definitely, I think I'm excited about the Google Dev Fest weekend because it's nice to talk about all these things at a high level in a kind of wishy-washy way, but to actually be talking about it with people who are kind of being brought into this discussion and at the front lines of it, I think helps you to narrow and focus the conversation. So I'm really looking forward to that one.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Ellen, for taking the time to come and talk to us today. It's been fantastic having you on the show.
What a great guest to have, someone who's literate, who's studied the law, is a technologist. This is the future, James. It's these sort of Renaissance people who have all sorts of interests, and it's really now all blending together in our world of tech and our world of AI and our world of ethics.
That's a very kind description. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks for joining us on AI Australia. We hope you got a lot out of it. If you enjoyed the show, feel free to leave us a review on iTunes by searching for AI Australia and giving us your honest feedback. It goes a long way to boost our visibility when you do that, so we really appreciate it. As always, we'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, head to eliza.com.au/contact and drop us a note. Thanks again and look forward to seeing you next week.